bit of a far cry. Some of you won't have been here for that first LDC, but I remember you got me to speak. There was no chair, no stage, no mic, and you had me speaking while the staff were pouring coffee and everyone was queuing for their sandwiches. So this is definitely a step up. But if we sort of, the LDC has become a sort of useful marker for me in this, doing my job first in opposition and now in government. And I remember in the conversation with John last year, 12 months ago, I said, look, the world had become less predictable, more dangerous. And actually, if you take stock from the last 12 months, then that has redoubled in the last year. We've seen Russian escalation in Ukraine. We've seen the incursion into NATO airspace twice, triggering Article 4. We've seen, as I exposed yesterday, and I'll come to that, covert operations as part of increasing Russian activity and aggression in the high north and on other parts of NATO's flanks. We've seen China, and let's not take our eyes off China, encircle Taiwan with the biggest, closest military deployment we've yet seen, and I think a total of nearly 12 hours of live firing during that exercise. And then, of course, this large, wide-scale conflict in the Middle East, and the UK, beyond Cyprus, now has 1,000 UK personnel deployed to reinforce defences of British people and bases and allies in the Middle East. So it demands an immediate response as well as a sort of bigger strategic reflection and response. So today I'm announcing, in relation to the Middle East, a new initiative with Cambridge Aerospace. It's a veteran-led startup. We're going to see from them within weeks hundreds of new interceptor missiles and launchers that we'll be able to put to our own forces and our allies within the Middle East to reinforce the air defences and then deterrence beyond that. But I think we're undoubtedly in this new era of defence because of the new era of threat. And I think I would just, if I may, just say, look, you've got a government that recognises this, that is responding to this. We published our strategic defence review just after your last conference. We're already implementing the recommendations of that. We have stepped up and we lead the Ukraine Contact Defence Group of nations supporting Ukraine. We're co-leading the Coalition of the Willing with France. You've seen us sign new bilateral agreements, deep bilateral agreements with other, particularly European nations. You've seen us win a record level of defence exports for this country. And you've seen us sign 1,200 major contracts. And then finally, this is all underpinned, of course, by a commitment and a record rise in defence spending, which we haven't seen since the end of the Cold War. Now, would I like more resources? Yes, of course, every defence secretary would. And we have to make sure our defence resources are used to best effect. They will increase as we see the increase in defence spending playing through. But for now, those are the big sort of decisions that sort of underpin the sort of deployments that I have to make decisions on. And yesterday was I think, important in three respects, if I may. First, at a time when all eyes have understandably been on the conflict in the Middle East, it was a reminder that our outstanding armed forces are doing a job 24/7 to protect against other threats, and the primary threat to the UK remains Russian aggression and rising Russian activity. Second, it was important because it was exposing a failed covert Russian operation. And we know that Russia operates with a deniability. We've seen the way that in the Baltic, cables have been cut by suspect Russian-linked vessels. What we did yesterday was to say to Putin, we're watching you, we're exposing you, and if there is any damage to our cables and our pipelines, then you haven't got that deniability that allows you to pursue the sort of playbook that we've seen of the hybrid warfare from Putin. And finally, important as well, Ian, if I may, because it wasn't just a military operation. At a time when I want to see Britain become the best place to invest in the world, and in particular in defence, I want to see Britain become the best place to invest and grow and start up new defence companies. And confident investment requires economic stability. You know, the Chancellor was right last year when she said, look, a strong economy needs a strong defence. And when so much of our way of life relies now on undersea cables and pipelines, that critical infrastructure undersea becomes critical to our national security and our economic resilience. And so the job to follow up yesterday is in part a combination of the efforts of the military, of wider parts of government and industry to reinforce our security and that economic resilience. And so today I'm also convening discussions of military leaders. We'll be discussing this with the chiefs and also industry and investor figures to discuss how that matter of security and our economic prospects and growth come together but need to be a combined effort.
So our theme for LDC 2026 is readiness, and you described, you know, a really tough backdrop. We've got what's happening in Iran, there's full-scale war raging in Ukraine. In straightforward terms, the UK, can you actually say, you know, are we ready?
Yes. And I think what I set out yesterday demonstrates just how ready our forces are when required. This was more than a month of operations which involved 500 UK personnel. Our P8s and our pilots flew over 450 hours. Our frigate did several thousand nautical miles. You know, this was a big operation alongside allies, particularly our Norwegians. Colleagues, to track, to deter, and then to call out what Putin was trying to do as a secret submarine operation. And I think I hope it's also a reassurance to the public that whilst people are rightly concerned about the conflict in the Middle East, we're not taking our eyes off Putin, we're not taking our eyes off the primary threat, and we do have an armed forces that is demonstrating its capabilities to track and deter, and if necessary, there are options to respond as well.
Well, a lot of people here today and out there in the, you know, in the wider world will be thinking, how can it be, with all that you've described, everything that's going on, that we still don't have the defence investment plan? I mean, are there any sightings, any news? Should we buy the Treasury a television? I mean, you know, it was supposed to be announced in September. People are really keen to see it. Any updates?
Well, I think you follow these things still closely, even though you're not a working journalist. You'll have seen it in the House of Commons at the Liaison Committee last week. The Prime Minister said, look, he was taking a personal interest in completing this. I know it's a highest priority for him as it is for me. But this is a 10-year investment plan. It's got to put right a programme that we had under the last government that was overcommitted, it was underfunded, it was unsuited to the threats we faced. I think the important thing for me is it's not stopping us getting on with the job. You know, I'm making the announcement today on Cambridge Aerospace. You could point to the £1 billion of the investment in the military helicopters in Yeovil. You could point to the 1,200 major contracts that we've confirmed and let since the election. So we're making the investments we need. We're letting the contracts we need. We're starting to rebuild the forces in the way that we need. And we will publish the investment plan as soon as we can.
I mean, it strikes me as a 20-year story involving all the major parties. I mean, this stretches back to tail end of New Labour, and then what turned out to be pretty disastrous reductions in spending by the coalition
Yeah.
parties. So this question of hollowed out, I know the parties like to play games with each other and accuse each other of being more responsible, but thinking about it from the perspective, from a national perspective, it seems to be an almost, a cross-party, multi-generation failure. At some point, surely there has to be explained to the public that defence is just going to have to command a much higher share of our attention and national spending.
I think the public recognise that. I think you see that reflected in the level of concern and the recognition that we need to do more on defence. And at one level, you're right, this is a post-Cold War story. But I have to tell you, as Defence Secretary, over the last 20 months, I've been dealing with the legacy of the last 14 years. And I was part of the Labour government. And I remember in 2010, when we left government in 2010, we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence. We've had nowhere near that in any of the 14 years since. The strength of our full-time army was over 100,000 soldiers. And you can look at the cut in the number of mine hunters, the number of warships, the delay in the renewal of our nuclear deterrent. These are deeply baked problems that we need to now deal with. And that will take time. But we're making a start, so extra 300 million in shipbuilding last year, doubling the budget for autonomy to £4 billion. These are steps that we've taken already and are underway. We won't fix those overnight. But we have made this commitment, and we'll see it next year, the largest sustained increase of defence spending since the end of the Cold War, that Cold War story for you. And no one in this room, some with very distinguished long careers in defence, has worked in a period where there is a certain decade of increased defence spending ahead. And that, particularly when we are able to set out the defence investment plan, gives people I hope, the sort of confidence and certainty to make some of the long-term decisions that are necessary for this country in a way that we haven't been able to do before.
Last year at LDC, the PM spoke and he said that defence is, quotes, the central organising principle of government, the first thought in the morning and the last thought at night, which is clearly, in the world we're living in, that's clearly is correct. But is that felt and understood, do you think, really across government? I listened to the budget and back in November, and defence didn't feature much. I'm wondering about the wider national conversation. You said the public get it, but is this gap, and we're hoping to address some of this at the conference in the next couple of days, in terms of whole of society readiness and resilience and how people think about this. I'm just slightly worried about the gap between that statement and what's understood in government and in the wider country.
I thought that was a really important speech and a very important sort of declaration of first duty and first principle from the Prime Minister. I think you saw it amplified when he made his Munich Security Conference speech a month or so ago, where he said that hard power is the currency of the age, where he said that we know that we must spend more, faster on defence, and the personal commitment that he has made to leading the reset of relations with crucial allies, the commitment that he's making at the moment out in the Middle East to scope the sort of discussions for a strengthening of the ceasefire and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. For me, I've set out to do something else with defence, which isn't just to recognise that defence is central to a nation's security. I've wanted to make defence also central to the nation's success. So you've seen the way that the defence investments that we've made, I talked about 1,200 major contracts, 86% of those have gone to British-based businesses. so that defence becomes an engine for economic growth, helping to reinforce the number one mission of this government. I've wanted to see defence become part of a pride and a patriotism that isn't divisive and isn't backward-looking. And so part of my sort of underlying purpose yesterday was not just to call out the Russian threat, to demonstrate that Britain is ready and does respond, but it's also to recognise and thank the armed forces, because I think there's a natural appreciation of what they do that is a reflection of a pride in the country. And so I think there's more to that declaration from the Prime Minister than you'd see at first value. Yes, of course, it's central to the duty of any Prime Minister in any government, and that runs throughout almost every meeting that I see him chair and I'm with him in government. But I think there's a deeper truth and a deeper potential for those of us involved in the defence and wider security industry. This is an opportunity not just to demonstrate that collectively, whether we're in government, in the military or in industry, we can respond to the challenges of the time, but that we can make our world central to the concerns, the challenges and the solutions that people see. And fundamentally, if we want to see this increasing in government, in public investment in what we do and what we believe is needed, then we've got a job to be able to gain the acceptance, maintain the acceptance and understanding of the public to support investments in defence, because to some extent they will always come at the expense of other areas that people would like to see action.
Should we talk a little bit about Jeff? And we're absolutely delighted that the Jeff CHODS, Chiefs of Defence, are here, and also thrilled, joined by their Canadian counterpart. I mean, tell us a bit about how you see Jeff. Certainly at LDC, we regard it as an absolutely critical grouping, big part of our mission. We term it the Northern Alliance, and you know our view, which is that what's going on in the world is not a blip. This is the story of the next 10, 20, 30 years. How would you like to see Jeff develop?
First, I like the way that you've made that one of the sort of central focuses of the LDC, and you've done that from the start. I really like the fact you've managed to invite and encourage all the Jeff chiefs to the conference here. This might sound strange from a politician, but I think Jeff works best when its focus remains on the operational and on the military, and the degree of ministerial meetings, whether those are leaders, defence ministers or foreign ministers, is dialed down rather than up. That's number one. Number two, why do I say that? Because I think its real strength is within NATO. It's the group of nations that are ready to act, that are sufficiently like-minded, sufficiently willing to recognise where, particularly in our part of the sort of wider NATO area, there are pressing Russian threats and increasing activity. And I think you've seen this in a number of instances. So when the Russian activity interfering or linked activity that started interfering with some of the underwater cables became a pressing problem, it was the Jeff nations through Nordic Warden that first reacted. That then became taken up with the NATO unanimity into Baltic Sentry. So it was Jeff, if you like, leading edge, innovating military solutions. I'd like to see it more developed in a sort of industrial reflection of that sort of collaboration and innovation as well. So that's the first thing. Second is that I think it's become more important better recognised, better understood within NATO. I think the big...
You mean that it complements NATO rather
Oh, totally.
than contradicts
It is part of NATO, but it is definitely, and its role and value to the wider NATO is seen more clearly. So I think the CHASES exercise, really big exercise last year. We had 1,700 UK personnel involved in that. Canada was part of it. Germany supported it for the first time as well. Becoming well established, and I think when we see and other people see the plans for Lion Protector later this year in the High North, concentrating on the sort of exercising and rehearsing for shadow shipping threats, undersea infrastructure threats, as well as that wider High North security, I think its role and value will become more and more clear.
Should we talk a bit about the US in the context of what's going on in the Middle East? The president is, I think, to put it politely, very displeased with NATO. It sounds as though he's actually shifting away from the NATO Hague summit position of 3.5 plus 1.5 demands for more money to something bigger than that. What, in that context, what would you say to, and we have some very distinguished American guests with us, and we have members of Congress who are joining sessions later today. What would you say about NATO to the Americans?
I'd reflect back to the Americans what the Americans are saying to us, and what the Americans led and were part of agreeing last year at The Hague. And you know, in my sort of talks with the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, when I sit next to him at NATO defence ministers, the two things that are clear and consistent, and that's been the case with what the Prime Minister's had from President Trump, is that the commitment to NATO in Article 5 remains. The recognition that this is part of the defence and deterrence that is protecting the US and North America, not just the Euro-Atlantic is there, but the requirement of other NATO nations, particularly the European nations, and rightly they are making these demands on us, is that we step up, that we make NATO more European, that we step up on NATO security in the way that I think the UK can genuinely say we are, and we've more to do. They've required us to step up on leadership on Ukraine, and we are doing that. And they're requiring us to step up on defence investment. Now, they're pushing us to go further, they're pushing us to go faster. I understand that, but those, for me, are the fundamentals of what is a very deep commitment that America has to NATO, a very deep commitment that NATO and the UK have, US and the UK have uniquely. And in the end also, if you look in that UK-US relationship, in the end, you know, I'd rather our actions spoke for themselves. And if you look even in this current conflict, the basing permissions that we in the UK have agreed with the US have been invaluable to their military operations.
But the President does seem furious about the gap at the beginning.
Sure, but there are also some really... Look, a lot, you know, in northern Iraq, you know, our RAF regiment has been almost daily taking down drones and jointly protecting US forces and that joint base we've got with them. You know, if we focus on our actions rather than just simply the exchange of words and social media posts, then the fundamentals for me remain. The fundamentals for me remain that America is absolutely locked into, with benefits as well as massive contributions to NATO. We have to do more. we are and we will on the European side. And there are deep values that our nations share that in the end will see us through the ups and downs of the political cycles as they have done, both sides of the Atlantic in previous decades.
But do you think, is this a permanent shift, do you think? Or is this just a kind of ebb and flow in American politics? I mean,
I think there's I think they're right. I think this is a long-term shift where Europe has to recognise that we've got to do more of the heavy lifting for our own security and within NATO. We will, and for the UK, we have a particular role and responsibility to help lead that.
Yeah, the holiday from history is over, but I'm just wondering, do you or your colleagues get a chance to point out, and speaking as a transatlanticist as you are, to point out the advantages for our American friends of having that forward, having those forward bases, having what they have in Germany and having what the US has in the UK, not just in terms of delivering what's happened in the Middle East recently, but more broadly, it gives America power projection. I'm just wondering whether that whole, the understanding of those realities is being lost or eroded.
No, I'm confident in that sort of underpinning understanding, and I think if you want confirmation and expression of that, I think the US Defence Strategy Review was a good exposition of the challenges the US is quite rightly posing, led by the president, but perhaps expressed in different ways or different terms in the defence strategy for Europe, for NATO, and a recognition that there are priorities for the US which understandably are also elsewhere.
Final question, because we're up against it on time. We haven't really had time to talk about Ukraine, though you've mentioned it. Just on the China question, where do you think we are in terms of the defence and national security debate and Britain's posture on China? Because we are, on the one hand, in economic terms, it seems there's an effort to get back closer to China, but then beyond all the Iran stuff, it's the big challenge of the next 10, 20 years. How do you think about China as a challenge?
I think about China and the government, I think, as probably many people in this conference would, as not being reducible to a sort of single approach. We've got to cooperate with them on the things that matter. We've got to be able to challenge them on the things that we have to as well. And for me, and I made a point of mentioning China in my just opening remarks, because the one thing that we can't do and shouldn't do, and nor should our allies, is take our eye off China when we risk being distracted by other things like the Middle Eastern conflict.
Secretary of State, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us today. We're about to be joined on stage. We're just about to leave the stage by Chief of the Defence Staff, and Mark Irvin is going to come back and facilitate all of that, and then the Jeff Chods. But thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure, thank you, and I hope you all have a very good conference.